Hey everybody, my name is Mr. Riggs if you don't know me, and today's objective is Objective 100. Students will be able to add and subtract integers. Some things you might not be able to see perfectly, so feel free to pause the video as needed, but students will be able to add and subtract integers. So right here we have our number line, okay? Look at part 1. Number 1's asking how far away from 0 is the number 8? Well, not supposed to be a tough question, it's just 8 units away. And you can count to it. If you started here at 8, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So it's 8 units away from 0. Question 2 is how far away from 0 is the number -6? Well, same idea. A lot of students here, though, they put -6. But distance is always positive. So if we start here at -6 and try to go to 0, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 units away from 0. Okay? Number 3, a little vocab. The absolute value is the distance. The absolute value is the distance a number is from 0. And that's what we just figured out here. We figured out how far 8 and 6 were away from 0. Notice, and add this little key point to your notes. Distance is always positive. Again, you might not be able to hear me or see the words perfectly, but listen for my voice. I'll give you the notes as we go along, okay? But distance is always positive. So the absolute value is always going to be positive. And then another vocab word, we have integer. An integer is a positive. I just put a plus sign for positive. Or a negative. I just put a minus sign for negative. So an integer is a positive or a negative whole number. That might be a new vocab word for some of you, but a whole number is just, it's not a fraction, it's not a decimal, it's just a whole number, okay? So please get those notes down before we move on to our next section. All right, everybody, we're back with the bottom part of this first page. Just to be clear, I might not have been clear enough in the first part. A whole number is just not a decimal, not a fraction, so 5 would be an example of a whole number, okay? Just to be clear about that. Now, we're right here for rules for integer addition and subtraction. Key point for this first kind of type of integer addition and subtraction. Notice that if the signs are the same, those are the two words that go in the blanks there, just add the values and keep the same sign. So if you're not quite sure what we mean by signs, we're talking about the plus or the minus sign. So if you notice that the numbers you're trying to add or subtract have the exact same sign, a quick trick is you just add the values and keep the sign the same. So let's look at example 1 right here. This is 1 plus 5. Super simple. I know you all know it's 6. Here's kind of why we can use this quick shortcut. Obviously there's a plus sign in front of the 5. That's a positive value. Now you don't notice any sign in front of the 1. If you don't see a sign, you can assume it's positive. So this is technically a plus 1. They have the same sign. You add them up, you get 6, and you keep the sign. Well, it's already positive, so it stays positive. Super simple. On to number 2. 6 plus 5, you all know it's 11. Not a tough question, but the principles are important. They have the same sign. This is a positive sign. This is a positive sign. You can't see it, but again, if you don't see it, you can assume it's positive. So they both have the same sign. You just add the values, and then keep the same sign. So we keep the positive. You can put it as plus 11 or just leave it as 11. Now this is where it gets a little more tricky. This is where some students start to struggle. First thing you should notice is, okay, they both have the same sign. This is -3 and -1. They both have the exact same sign. They both have a negative sign. So let's use our rule. If we recognize they have the same sign, let's add the values. So 3 and 1, that's just 4. And then keep the sign. And that's -4. And you can always use the number line to do any addition or subtraction. If we started at a -3 and took 1 away, went 1 more negative, we'd be at -4. So that's how the number line interacts with just our quick shortcut rules. Number 4, same idea. Notice how they both have the same sign. They're both negatives, -2 and -7. So let's use our quick shortcut. Add the values. 2 plus 7 is 9, and then keep that sign. So it's -9. -2 minus 7 is -9. And again, we could have started at -2 on the number line, and then gone back 7 more negative, we would have ended up at -9. Now number 5, it looks a little tricky because you have -4 and then plus -6. It's the sign right in front of the number, that's the sign you care about. So right here we have -4 and we have -6. Those numbers have the exact same sign. So same rule applies, we're going to add the values. 4 plus 6 is 10, and then keep the original sign at -4 plus -6 is a -10. Go ahead and finish the examples on this page. I'm not going to show you the answers. We can discuss those in class. All right, we should be on page 2 by now. We're on to key point number 2. It's kind of the next instance of what to do when we're adding and subtracting integers. So if the signs, again, the first blank is the word signs, are different. You probably could have guessed that even before I said it. If the signs are different, we're going to subtract the absolute value of the numbers and keep the sign of the larger absolute value. Sounds really wordy, it sounds complicated, it's super, super simple, okay? We're going to use this example to kind of help us fill in the notes for this section right here. So the first question you're asking yourself, these are kind of your guiding questions. Are the signs different? Well, obviously they're different, so you're like, yes, they're different. I put a check mark and you said, yes, you recognize that they are different. You can put a smiley face if you want to, just to be like, hey, I figured out, yes, those signs are different. Not hard. Next, we're going to find the absolute value of both numbers, okay? We haven't really got into what the absolute value is, but it goes back to that first page. How far are each of these numbers from 0? Well, the absolute value of -9 is just 9. -9 is 9 units away from 0. 8, that is 8 units away from 0. Okay, notice that the absolute value is the distance from 0, that's why it's always positive. You might want to add this as a key point. These lines around the outside, that means absolute value. If you ever saw like the absolute value of -9, that's just 9. This is a little extra. Okay, don't let this confuse you. The idea is it's the distance from 0. Okay? So we found the absolute value of -9 and 8. And we kind of ask ourselves, which absolute value is bigger? Well, it's obvious that this is the bigger number. 9 is bigger than 8. What we're going to do right away, the reason that's important is because, I'm going to circle this one because this is the step that matters. We're going to keep the sign of that number. So go back to the original. Notice how 9 had a negative to start. I'm going to go ahead and put that with the answer. I know my answer is going to be negative because when I add these values, that has a bigger sign, so my answer is going to end up being negative. From there, just go ahead and subtract the absolute values. So again, we found the absolute values, 9 and 8. 9 minus 8 is 1. Hopefully that wasn't too tough. And from there, just keep the sign of the large absolute value, so my final answer is -1. Sorry if these circles confuse you. This is our final answer right here. -9 plus 8 is a -1. Okay? So let's apply that same principle to number 1. Now, I'm not quite sure if you can see me, but you have the notes in front of you. We have 1 minus 5. First thing you're asking yourselves is, are the signs the same? Are the signs different? They are different. It's a +1, it's a -5. Go on to step 2. Find the absolute value of those numbers. The absolute value of 1 is just 1. The absolute value of -5 is 5. 5 is clearly the bigger number. So the fact that it had a negative sign in front of it, go ahead and put a negative where your answer is going to be. You know the final answer will be negative. From there, to subtract the absolute values. If we did, you can do it 5 minus 1. In fact, you should subtract the bigger one minus the smaller one. So 5 minus 1 is just 4. So your final answer is going to be -4. So 1 minus 5 is a -4. Okay? Go ahead and finish the rest of this page. This is probably the trickiest example, so please take your time. And again, if this is confusing, use a number line. You could use the first value as your starting value and take some away or add some, depending on what the problem is, and see where you end up. Okay? Again, first key point was, if the signs are the same, we just add the values and keep the sign that we had to start with. Key point 2 was talking about if the signs are different, we're going to keep the sign of the larger absolute value, subtract the absolute values, and that's going to be your resulting answer. Now we're on to this kind of third, not even a different instance, but just an important key point to remember. A negative sign next to a negative sign becomes a positive sign. I'm sure you've heard this before in your middle school days. Hopefully not a brand new topic, but a negative sign by a negative sign becomes a positive sign. So let's look at example 1, okay? At first, okay, the 1, the positive sign, the negative 5, well, it's a negative sign. And if according to our key point 2, you do the absolute value and subtract those, but we need to pause before we do that because the first thing you need to notice is there's a negative right by a negative. So before we can even get into all of that trying to simplify, because that's what we're doing. When we get down to one answer, we're just simplifying this expression. Before we do that, this negative side by side, we need to turn it into a positive. So this expression actually becomes 1 plus 5, which is super easy, that's just 6. That's why you always have to, if there are negatives side by side, make it into a positive. Same idea here. We have 6 minus a negative 5. We have negatives side by side. That becomes a positive. So it's really 6 plus 5 equals 11. And notice how much easier these become once you simplify. Okay, like these are just simple addition. Moving on to number 3. Again, there's a lot of negatives going on. These are not side by side. This one, they're not side by side. Please don't confuse it. They literally have to be side by side. Even if there's parentheses in between, that's okay. But these negatives are side by side. These negatives are not side by side. There have to be no other numbers in between them for us to consider them side by side. So right here, let's take care of that first. This is negative 3. Those negatives become a positive. So it's really, sorry, my voice just cracked. That's a little embarrassing. Negative 3 plus 1. Now we go back to our second key point. The signs are different. Okay, so we have to use our rule if the signs are different. Okay. Find the absolute value of both. Well, that's going to be 3 and 1. Clearly 3 is bigger, so I'm going to go ahead and put negative by my answer. Keep the sign of the larger absolute value. Subtract the absolute values. 3 minus 1 is 2, and then that means negative 3 plus a 1 is a negative 2. Let's go on to number 4. 2 negatives side by side. You're welcome to pause the video here and try to finish this example before I do. It might be a good test to see, are you actually getting it? So feel free to pause and check to see if you got this one right. Negative side by side becomes a positive, so negative 2 plus 7. Same thing, signs are different. We have a negative sign and a positive sign. Find the absolute value of both. Remember, absolute value is just the distance the numbers are from 0. So negative 2, that's 2 units away from 0. And 7 is 7 units away from 0. Notice how 7 is the bigger number and 7 had a positive sign in front of it. So I'm going to put a plus sign by my answer to remind myself my answer is going to be positive. From there, I just subtract them. Always subtract the bigger one minus the smaller one when we're going through this process. So 7 minus 2 is 5. My final answer is a positive 5. You don't have to keep the plus sign if it's positive. You must keep the negative sign if it's negative, but you could also just leave this as 5. All right, we are on the bottom of page 3. One thing we need to make really clear, sometimes the video notes won't align to what your homework was. So if Ms. Hyder or myself said finish pages 1 through 5, that was your homework. Just because we don't go through that with the video doesn't mean it's not homework. This is the bottom of page 3. If your homework was to finish all of page 3, like it was pages 1 through 5, you better have the top of page 3 done, otherwise it will be a LaSalle. I'm just going to go to the notes on the bottom of page 3, make sure the rest of it is done if it was assigned for homework. All right, learning how to cuss in math. Also need to be clear. If you all walk in the door and start cussing, it'll be for demerits and detention. Don't do that, okay? This is a fun acronym that's helping to remind us how we annotate word problems in math class. Word problems were the toughest thing that our students struggled with last year. We want to make sure you all do a lot better than last year's class. So learning how to cuss in math class, okay? Each of these letters stands for a different word that's going to help remind you how to annotate word problems. Annotate is a fancy way of saying take notes or sort of explain word problems to yourself. The C stands for circle the question or statement. That's the first thing you will always do when we are reading and trying to solve word problems. Sometimes it's not a question, so we're going to circle the question or the statement. Whatever we're being asked to figure out or do, we're always going to circle that first to make sure we actually answer that question. A lot of times students do some great math, but they don't answer the question. That's not very helpful. C stands for circle the question. First thing we're always going to do. Next, the U is for underline, important information. We will do a lot of practice with how to identify important information, but it really goes back to the information that helps you answer the question. That's the important information. So if you think that information is going to help you answer the question, then you should underline it. You should make it obvious to yourself, I need that information to answer the question. All right, the first S just stands for solve. Go ahead and solve. Based on the information you thought was important, use that information to answer the question. The second S, and it's really important to not forget this, is a sanity check. Again, sometimes students may do really good math, but the numbers they use, the work they did, in no way answer the question, and their answer doesn't make any sense. Like, for example, if you answered a question about sports and somehow you said the person involved scored negative points, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like in basketball, for example, you can't score negative points. So if for some reason you got a negative answer in that kind of word problem, you should do a quick sanity check. Wait, that makes no sense. I must have just made a mistake somewhere. Okay? So do a quick sanity check. Ask yourself, does that answer make any sense? And if it doesn't, that's okay. Just go find out where you made a mistake. But this is what we say to cuss. This is how Ms. Hyder and I interpret cussing in math class. This annotation process that should make us really good at solving word problems. Alright, we're on the first word problem. It says no calculator because you don't need one. You can use one if you so choose, but you should be able to do all these without a calculator. I'll read number one. During a 5-day period, a telecommunications company's stock price went from $17.82 to $15.34 per share. Find the change in the price of the stock. If you don't know what a stock is, that's okay. I would look it up online. It's not going to necessarily help or hurt your ability to answer this question, but it's pretty cool to find out. Just for example, like Apple, like iPhones. Apple is a company that sells a stock. You can basically buy part of their company, and you can own part of it. That's what a stock is. It's a little bit of ownership in a company. But in this case, we have companies whose stock price went from $17.82 to $15.36 per share. Find the change in that stock price. Well, what I'm going to write out here to the side is the word cuss. If your parents ask you, hey, why are you writing cuss all over your homework, please explain to them so we don't get in trouble. We would appreciate that. I'm going to write that so I go through very carefully and make sure I annotate properly. C is circle the question or the statement right here. Find the change in the price of the stock. That's what I'm trying to do. If I don't answer that, if I don't do what that's asking me, then I haven't answered the question. I haven't done what I'm supposed to do. Next, I'm going to underline any important information. Numbers are almost always part of that important information. It's saying the stock price went from $17.82 to $15.36. Okay, I'm going to make a note that this was my starting price, and this was my ending price. That's also part of annotating, is actually trying to explain the question in your own words. And I'm looking through, the 5-day period doesn't really matter. It didn't ask me to find the average, it's just saying that was the change. So I'm trying to find the change in that stock price. I think I've underlined everything I really need to. From there, I'm going to go ahead and solve. Well, if it starts at $17.82 and it goes to $15.36, that change is asking me to subtract. It's asking me to find the difference. Finding the difference is subtraction. So I'm going to subtract $17.82. I'm going to subtract $15.36 from that value. So I'm going to go ahead and solve, okay? I can't do that. I got to borrow. 1 minus 1 is 0, so I'm going to leave it at $2.46. Now, that's my answer. I'm saying the stock price changed $2.46. I should be a little more clear. Whenever you answer word problems, we're expecting you to put it in a full sentence. So I'm going to say, the stock price dropped. You could also say went down. That means the same thing as dropped. $2.46. This is an answer that deserves full credit. I showed my work, I annotated, and I put my answer in a full sentence. Any word problem, you must answer in a full sentence. If you don't, it's a LaSalle. We told you now, don't be confused later on. Same thing, if you don't properly annotate your questions, it's also going to be a LaSalle. This shows hard work. This shows you actually put time into your homework, and if you don't, you're not prepared for class. So you need to stay in LaSalle and get more prepared for the next day going forward, okay? Go ahead and finish the rest of the word problems if it was assigned for homework. and we'll talk more about it in class.